In December 1937, Japanese officers didn't just kill the women of Nanjing. They turned their suffering into souvenirs. They lined women in the streets, posed beside their bodies, and smiled for photographs. Not as evidence of war crimes, but as trophies. And here's the part that should freeze your spine. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't soldiers losing control. It was policy. Planned. Ordered. Recorded. Written directly into military reports. But believe it or not, that's not even the darkest truth. Because what I'm about to show you is something historians, governments, and entire militaries have quietly buried for centuries. Sexual violence and public execution weren't side effects of war. They were weapons of war. As strategic as burning crops. As calculated as siege tactics. As intentional as dropping bombs. And here's the part nobody is prepared for. It's still happening today. Right now. Before this video ends, you're going to see 3 pieces of evidence that will permanently change how you understand war. 1. An ancient Roman military manual that explicitly describes sexual violence as a tactical method. A way to break enemy morale by conquering their women. 2. A public execution technique engineered not for death, but for humiliation. Designed to spread terror faster than any army could advance. 3. Proof that every major army in modern history, Allied, Axis, Soviet, American-backed forces, all used the same weapon. No exceptions. You won't hear this in school. You won't read this in textbooks. But once you know it, you'll never look at war the same way again. So if you're still watching, hit that subscribe button. Because this is about to get darker. And next week, I'll reveal something even more disturbing. How modern militaries still train for this tactic under different names. But don't click away. Because in exactly 5 minutes, I'm going to show you the one document that proves this was an impulse. It wasn't rage. It wasn't loss of control. It was planned. Proved. Systematized. For over 2,000 years. Now let me expose the weapon hidden in plain sight. Picture the world map. Now watch as every conflict where systematic sexual violence was recorded begins to glow. Ancient Rome. Medieval Europe. Colonial Americas. World War II, both theaters. Korea. Vietnam. Bangladesh. Bosnia. Rwanda. Congo. Darfur. Syria. Ukraine. It stops looking like a map. It becomes a constellation. Here's the truth textbooks avoid. Wartime sexual violence is not collateral damage. It is not undisciplined soldiers. It is not the fog of war. It is strategy. Roman generals wrote about it openly. Ottoman strategists described it precisely. Japanese officers photographed it. Modern armies renamed it. And here's the part that matters in 2024. The United Nations is currently monitoring over 20 active conflicts where sexual violence is being deployed as a weapon. Not 20 incidents. 20 conflict zones. This weapon isn't ancient. It's not retired. It's not history. You're watching it unfold on the news. You just didn't know what you were seeing. But to understand why this weapon works, you need to understand the twisted military logic behind it. A logic perfected by the most efficient killing machine the world has ever seen. The Roman Empire. Rome didn't just defeat enemies. It erased civilizations. And worst of all, it wrote down the method. Step by step. Open any translation of Livy's History of Rome. It's available on Amazon. Go to the founding myths. You'll find something that should make you sick. The Romans told the story of the rape of the Sabine women. Not as a tragedy, but as a tactic. Livy describes it clearly. At a given signal, the young Romans rushed to seize the daughters of their neighbors. Most were taken at random. The most beautiful were reserved for the senators. Read that again. At a given signal. Not chaos. Not impulse. A signal. Coordinated. Planned. Commanded. And here's what your history teacher never told you. Roman military doctrine justified this tactic with cold, calculated logic. You could defeat an enemy army in battle, and they'd rebuild, recover, return for revenge. But violate their women publicly? Force pregnancies? Their children couldn't claim their father's lineage. The family line ended. The community's future was erased. This wasn't just conquest. It was identity erasure. In Roman strategy they called it conquest of the conquered. You didn't just take their land. You replaced their bloodline. Imagine you're defending your city. You have walls, weapons, trained soldiers. You're ready to die fighting. But the enemy doesn't attack your walls. They didn't storm the walls of a city. They attacked something no army can defend with shields or swords. A people's identity, their bloodline, their future itself. That isn't combat. That is psychological annihilation. And it worked so effectively that the Roman Empire carried this strategy across 3 continents for nearly 1,000 years. Other empires watched what Rome did. They learned. They adapted. They refined it. Now keep this pattern in your head. Violation, forced pregnancy, public display. You're about to watch this exact formula resurface in the modern era, but magnified to an industrial level. Rome fell in 476 AD. Their empire collapsed. But their playbook? Their strategy? It survived. And 1,461 years later, in 1937, one army resurrected this ancient tactic and scaled it like a factory system. What happened in Nanking over the span of 6 weeks remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. And the most chilling part is that it was documented by the perpetrators themselves. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't drunken brutality. This wasn't soldiers out of control. This was organized, systematic, methodical, and the evidence still sits in military archives. When Japanese forces entered Nanking in December 1937, officers didn't just permit atrocities. They organized them. Soldiers lined up. Women were forced into rows. Officers photographed what happened, kept the pictures, and even posed beside the bodies as if they were trophies. We know this because the photographs were recovered in 1945 and presented at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. 20,000 to 80,000 women. Ages, 6 to 80. 6 weeks. But here's the detail that exposes the strategy. After the assaults, soldiers performed public executions with bayonets. Bodies were left in the streets. Not hidden. Not buried. But deliberately placed in the busiest areas where civilians were forced to see them. German businessman John Rabe lived in Nanking during the occupation. He kept a diary. It still exists. December 17, 1937. The horror in the city is indescribable. Bodies lie in the streets as public warnings. This is not war. This is systematic terror. Systematic. He used that exact word. But here's the part almost nobody hears. Because it destroys the comforting belief that this was a uniquely Japanese atrocity. It wasn't. This strategy wasn't cultural. It wasn't isolated. It wasn't limited to one army, one ideology, or one region. And the proof? The most uncomfortable proof of all? The Allies themselves, the supposed liberators, committed the same crime. The same generals who condemned Nanking at international tribunals led armies that repeated the same pattern in 1945. Your school textbook probably skipped this chapter. Most do. Because it turns heroes into perpetrators. When Berlin fell in 1945, the city expected liberation. Instead, it became the site of one of the largest mass atrocities in modern warfare. British historian Anthony Beevor spent years buried in Soviet military archives after the Cold War. His findings, published in the fall of Berlin 1945, are devastating. Soviet forces assaulted an estimated 2 million German women. During the occupation of Berlin and Eastern Germany. 2 million. We know the numbers because the hospital records survived. Berlin hospitals recorded over 100,000 abortion procedures between 1945 and 1946. One city. 12 months. But here's the part that turns this from individual crimes into a systemic weapon of war. Allied High Command knew. The complaints reached Eisenhower's headquarters. Reports came from German civilians, Red Cross workers, even Soviet officers disturbed by what they saw. The leadership was informed. The response? Silence. No orders to stop. No disciplinary actions. No investigations. And it wasn't just Germany. As Soviet forces pushed through Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, territories they were there to liberate, women in those regions were targeted the same way. This wasn't cultural. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't chaos. This was the same signal Rome had given 2,000 years earlier. A method designed to break communities faster than any army could march. And if you're still here, if you're still watching, it means you're not just curious about history. You're willing to confront the parts that nations try to erase. Next week, I'm uncovering how modern militaries still use the same psychological tactics, but under sanitized terms like morale degradation and population destabilization. Trust me, you'll recognize the methods instantly. But here's the question no historian wanted to face for centuries. Why did nobody listen? Why did the world wait until 2003 to finally read the testimonies that survivors tried to speak decades earlier? Because exposing this truth forces us to confront a reality far more uncomfortable than any battlefield statistic. Sexual violence in war isn't a side effect. It's a system, a military strategy, a psychological weapon designed to fracture communities faster than bullets ever could. And that brings us to right now, today, where the exact same tactics are being used in multiple active war zones around the world. Before we go there, let me show you the final link in the pattern, the modern era where the world had cameras, media, the United Nations, and still, the same weapon was deployed. Let's pick up where we left off. The moment the world thought it had learned after Nanking, after Berlin, after every tribunal came crashing down in the 1990s. Because during the era of satellite TV and CNN headlines, something emerged that should have been impossible. Rape camps. Not chaos. Not random acts. Organized facilities built for one purpose: systematic sexual violence as a military tactic. And the world watched. Rwanda. Bosnia. Two different continents. One identical strategy. In 1998, the International Criminal Tribunal made a ruling that changed history. They convicted Jean-Paul Akiyisu of genocide, not for killing, but for orchestrating sexual violence as a tool of group destruction. It was the first time in human history an international court said it plainly. Rape can be genocide. Not a consequence of war. A method of war. Witness testimony revealed something chilling. During the 1994 Rwandan genocide, extremist militias didn't just target women as a symbol, they targeted them as the future of their communities. They used the phrase "breaking the will to resist," written in survivor accounts and tribunal evidence. The numbers still stagger historians. 250,000 to 500,000 women violated in 100 days. Children born from these assaults were labeled with a term designed to wound entire bloodlines: children of hate. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate biological warfare. But Rwanda wasn't an anomaly. Across the world at the exact same time, another war was using an almost identical blueprint, but with even colder, more organized precision. Bosnia, 1992 to 1995. Serbian forces established camps, and this part is critical, with guards, schedules, rotations, and objectives. Survivors testified that the purpose wasn't only violation, it was forced pregnancy to shatter Muslim family structures permanently. Think about that for a second. This wasn't medieval brutality. This was logistical, documented, modern warfare in the age of satellites, radios, international observers. Commanders broadcast their acts on local radio. Executions were public. Bodies were displayed as warnings, the exact same psychological warfare used in Rome, Nanking, and Berlin. Do you see the pattern now? Rome, violation plus forced pregnancy to erase lineage. Nanking, violation plus execution as terror display. Berlin, mass violation to assert total conquest. Bosnia and Rwanda, organized violation plus forced pregnancy plus public broadcasting. Different centuries. Different uniforms. Same weapon. Same logic. Same goal. And here's the truth military historians still struggle to admit. Every army in history, every empire, every alliance, every political side, has used this weapon at some point. Romans, Japanese imperial forces, Soviet Red Army, Balkan militias, Armed groups backed by Western powers in the Cold War. No nation is exempt. No ideology is innocent. This isn't about culture. It's about war itself. In 1998, for the first time in 2,000 years of recorded history, international law finally spoke the truth out loud. Systematic sexual violence is a weapon of war. But recognizing it didn't stop it. According to the World Health Organization, in 2023 alone, over 250,000 women in active conflict zones experienced systematic sexual violence. In 2023, not ancient times. Ukraine reported it. Sudan reported it. Ethiopia reported it. Myanmar reported it. The weapon didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It changed language. It changed the excuses used to justify it. The tactic remained the same. So here's what history makes painfully clear. For over 2,000 years, across every continent and every major conflict, armies have used women's bodies as psychological weapons. Not by accident but by design. Because this weapon spreads terror faster than any bomb. It crushes morale. It shatters identity. It destroys the future of entire communities. And the world still doesn't talk about it. But now you know. And next week, I'm going even deeper into the classified documents and modern military doctrines that still teach these methods. Just under different names. Subscribe. Because the next chapter will change how you understand modern warfare forever. An estimated tens of thousands of Polish women and Yugoslav women, many of them partisans who had fought beside Soviet troops, were assaulted as the Red Army advanced. The message behind it was psychological and deliberate. We won. You belong to us now. All of you. But while this happened in the East, Western Europe had its own form of public punishment. Women accused of fraternizing with German soldiers were dragged into town squares by their own neighbors. Their hair was shaved. Their clothes ripped. Crowds spat on them as they were paraded through the streets. Look closely at those photographs. Look at the crowds. These were not soldiers. They were ordinary civilians. Mothers, teachers, shopkeepers, participating in ritual humiliation. The message was ancient, unchanged. Women's bodies are symbols of territory. Violate them and you declare ownership. And why isn't this in your history textbook? Because the post-war world needed clean heroes and clear villains. The Allies were supposed to be liberators. The Axis were supposed to be the only monsters. This story didn't fit that narrative, so historians buried it. Soviet archives stayed sealed. Western historians focused on battles and strategy. And survivors? Many never spoke. Some couldn't. Many didn't survive the trauma. You might be thinking, okay, but that was World War II. A different era. Different values. Modern warfare isn't like that. Stop. What comes next happened in the 1990s. The satellite era, the CNN era, the UN peacekeeper on the ground era. And they still used rape camps. Organized facilities with rotations and schedules. Rwanda. Bosnia. The war crime that never stopped. In 1998, the International Criminal Tribunal convicted Jean-Paul Akiyisu. Not for killing. But for rape as genocide. It was the first time in human history an international court ruled that systematic sexual violence is a form of genocide. During the 1994 Rwanda genocide, extremist militias didn't use sexual violence spontaneously. They organized it. Witnesses described soldiers calling it breaking the will to resist. Between 250,000 and 500,000 women were assaulted in just 100 days. The children born from this violence were given a chilling label. Children of hate. They were named, categorized, weaponized. But Rwanda wasn't unique. At the same time in Bosnia, another war deployed the same weapon, only with even tighter structure. Between 1992 and 1995, Serbian forces built rape camps. Not secret operations but fenced compounds with guards and schedules. Their purpose was explicit. Systematic impregnation of Muslim women. The military logic. Forced pregnancy makes the assault impossible to hide. The children become permanent reminders. It destroys family structures. It erases cultural lineage. Rome's ancient playbook 2,000 years later, now with GPS coordinates. Executions were even broadcast over local radio. Commanders described what they had done to specific women, then executed them publicly. The bodies became billboards. The radio made sure everyone heard about it. A 2,000-year pattern. Do you see it now? Rome, public violation plus forced pregnancy. Nanking, public violation plus execution. Berlin, mass violation to demonstrate total conquest. Bosnia and Rwanda, organized assault plus forced pregnancy plus broadcast terror. Different eras, different weapons, same tactic. And here's the truth historians avoid. Every army, every nation, every alliance has used this weapon at some point. Roman legions, Japanese imperial forces, the Soviet Red Army, Serbian paramilitaries, even US-backed militias in conflicts people rarely discuss. This isn't about one culture being especially brutal. It's about warfare itself. The 1998 Akiyisu conviction finally established that sexual violence is a weapon of war under international law. We now have tribunals, documentation, prosecutions. And yet, in 2023 alone, the World Health Organization estimates that over 250,000 women in active conflict zones endured systematic sexual violence. Ukraine, Sudan, Ethiopia, Myanmar. Different continents, same method. For more than 2,000 years, armies have weaponized women's bodies, not because soldiers lost control, not because of chaos or the fog of war, but because it works. Public violation plus execution creates terror more effective than any bomb. And now we arrive at the final truth, the part people still refuse to look at directly. For over 2,000 years, the weapon hasn't changed. The uniforms changed. The flags changed. The languages changed. But the tactic? Identical. Predictable. Repeated. Because public sexual violence isn't chaos. It isn't loss of control. It is strategy, one of the oldest and most effective psychological weapons in human warfare. Armies discovered long ago that violating women shatters entire communities. It breaks resistance without firing a single bullet. It rewrites identity, lineage, and memory. It terrorizes the living and haunts generations that come after. And most importantly for military commanders, it sends a message that no village, no nation, no identity can protect itself. And here's the part many historians still avoid. This isn't the story of brutal regimes or distant conflicts. Every empire has done this. Every alliance. Every era. Even the so-called good guys. When you zoom out across 20 centuries, the pattern becomes undeniable. Rome used forced pregnancy to erase enemy bloodlines. Nanking used public violation to break the spirit of an entire city. Berlin became a symbol of mass violence used to assert total domination. Rwanda and Bosnia turned violations into organized, systematic military operations. Modern conflicts continue the same tactics, just with satellite footage, social media, and international courts watching. And despite our tribunals, our resolutions, our declarations, the WHO reported that just last year, over 250,000 women in active war zones experienced systematic sexual violence. 20 centuries later, the weapon is still active. Not in secret, not in the shadows, but in plain sight. So what does all of this tell us? That women's bodies have been treated not as people, but as battlefields. As warnings. As messages from one army to another. War has always been fought on front lines, but just as often, it has been fought on bodies. Silently, deliberately, strategically. And until the world stops seeing these crimes as inevitable, until we stop burying them in footnotes, in forgotten archives, in whispered testimonies, nothing will change. Because you can't end a weapon you refuse to name. This isn't just history. It's the playbook of war. Past, present, and unless we confront it, future.